So in the second part of the lecture, let us discuss different types of environmental movements. As we discussed already that environmental movements are not a homogeneous category. There are diverse forms of environmental movement, there are diverse forms of environmentalism. So let us see how can we classify, how can we develop a typology for environmental movement. Perhaps one of the most common way of classifying environmental movement is to consider the resource base upon which the collective mobilization occurs. So therefore, you may come across several terminologies like forest-based movement, water movement, movement against pollution, movement against mining. In that sense, these classifications essentially highlight the resource base upon which the mobilization takes place. While there is certain merit in this kind of classification, one of the major problems of this kind of classification is that these classifications necessarily highlight differences in context, whereas the mobilizations may be of the same nature. So in that sense, when we say forest-based movements or water-based movement, maybe these movements are of one type, just the context is different, the space upon which the mobilization takes place, that is different, but the nature of movement, the characteristics of movement may be of the same type. So therefore, sometimes it becomes problematic to classify environmental movement based on the resource base upon which the collective mobilization occurs. Castells identifies three indicators on which he classifies these movements. These three indicators are identity, adversary and goal. According to Castells, every movement either produce a kind of identity or bring in a specific kind of identity. Secondly, a movement has an adversary upon which or against which it works or it tries to change a particular thing, and a goal is basically the broad message the movement wants to aim or the movement aims to achieve something. So Castells distinguishes environmental movements based on differences in their identity, the kind of identity that they produce or the kind of identity that they build, based on the adversary against whom they direct their action, and third, the goal, what they ultimately aims to achieve. According to Castells, the identity refers to self-definition of a movement of what it is. The adversary refers to movement's principal enemy, and societal goal refers to the movement's vision of the kind of social order or social organization that it would wish to attain. In that sense, Castells distinguishes 5 different categories, 5 different types of environmental movements, and distinguishes them based on their identity, adversary and goal. So let us see what are these 5 types of movement. The 5 different types of movement that Castells identifies are conservation of nature, second, defense of own space, third, counterculture environmental movement, fourth, save the planet, and the fifth one is green and sustainable development. Let me again clarify that as I just discussed, environmental movements are not necessarily protest against something. Environmental movements also include activities and efforts for environmental reconstruction. So in that sense, environmental movements include a wide range of activity which may involve protest, which may involve protest against the system, and which may also include activities or actions along with the system, along with the state, for environmental reconstruction or for restoration of nature. So let us see how these 5 different categories, 5 different types of environmental movements vary from each other based on their identity, adversary and societal goal. Let's first talk about nature conservation movements or conservation based on nature. What are the examples of these kind of movements? We may find there are several examples of these nature conservation movements, like for example the Sierra Club in United States. In the Indian context, we may find examples in the form of the WWF or Worldwide Fund for Nature, Wildlife Conservation Society, Nature Conservation Foundation, Wildlife First, Tiger Conservation Trust. So the basic aim of these environmental conservation movement is to conserve the nature, is to conserve the wildlife and the nature. What is the common identity that these movements provide, that these movements construct? The common identity mobilizes people, or which helps people to be a part of the collective mobilization, is that of their love for nature, is that of their concern for nature. So in that sense, they are nature lovers. So the issues of caste, issues of class, issues of different social categories doesn't figure prominently here. What is foregrounded is their concern for nature. What is foregrounded is their concern for environment. So therefore, social differences, caste and class differences, gender differences, differences in opinion, they are all set to the background, and what is foregrounded is our love for nature, our concernedness for nature. So therefore, the common identity that these nature conservation environmentalists or nature conservation environmental movement tries to portray, the common identity that it constructs is our concern for nature. And what are the methods of protest of these kind of environmental movements? These environmental movements or nature conservation movement mostly work for conservation through institutionalized mechanisms. So these conservation based movements mostly work with the state, they work with policy making, and they try to put pressure on state. They try to lobby and act as pressure groups to force the state or to put pressure on the state to come out with more conservation oriented policies. So in that sense, these movements or conservation movements are not necessarily protest against something. They mostly work along with the state, they work along with the government to come out with more conservation oriented policies. So in that sense, the participants of these movements are mostly conservationists who work along with the state, who work along with policymakers to bring forward more conservation oriented policies. With regard to the adversary or with regard to the common enemy, the central problem for these movements or the conservation oriented movements are the uncontrolled development and uncontrolled industrialization. So therefore, it is the industrialization process which destroys the nature, it is the industrialization process which degrades the nature that becomes the central enemy, and these environmental movement or the conservation oriented environmental movement wants to protect the nature from that of degradation by the industrialization process. So therefore, in that sense, it is the industrialism which becomes the common adversary for conservation movements, and conservation oriented movements want to preserve the forest, want to protect the forest from that of the negative impacts of industrialization. And what is the ultimate goal, what is the societal goal of these kind of movements? Conservation oriented movements basically aim at wilderness. Conservation oriented movements basically aim at preserving the forest, preserving the wildlife. So it is the protection of flora and fauna, it is the conservation of wildlife and the natural habitat that becomes the societal goal for this environmental movement. The second category of environmental movement that Manuel Castells defines is that of defense of own space. But these movements are essentially against an element. So the examples of these kind of movements may be local struggles in defense of land, life and livelihood. In the Indian context, we may find there are several displacement based movements which can be categorized into this type of defense of one's own space. Say for example, the environmental movement concerning the Narmada, the Save the Narmada movement, or environmental movement concerning the displacement that occurs because of mining, the environmental movement that results in deforestation because of dams. So all these dam based movements, water based movement, mining based movement, where essentially there is a contradiction against the capitalist state, there is a contradiction against the capitalist element, and where the basic issue is to claim ownership of the local space, is to claim autonomy over the local space, that may be included in this category of movement. What is the common identity that brings people together for this movement? The common identity that brings people together to this kind of movement, as well as the common identity that is produced by this movement, is that of affected people. So therefore, the participants in these movements are known, or they term themselves as affected people. They are affected, they are directly affected by environmental degradation. So therefore, it is the concern for social justice, it is a concern for their right over nature that becomes the central issue here. So therefore, the common identity here is affected people or affected concerned communities. What is the adversary in this kind of movement? In this kind of environmental movement which talks about defense of one's right over the local space or defense of local space, the major adversary or the main adversary is that of either industrial pollution or development or a capitalist state, because most of these movements essentially invoke the idea of space, essentially invokes the idea of physicality, because there is a particular space, particular geographical region which becomes the site of environmental degradation. environmental degradation, say in the form of deforestation, in the form of construction of dam which results in deforestation as well as displacement, construction of certain nuclear plants which results in pollution, that has a materiality involved in it, that has a physicality involved in it. So therefore these movements talk about establishing a autonomy over the local space. And what is the method of protest for these kind of environmental movements? Unlike the conservation based movements which mostly work through institutionalized means, these movements mostly function or mostly manifest themselves through direct action. So therefore we find more confrontations, we find more protest, we find more contradictions with an enemy, and the enemy here mostly the capitalist state or the capitalist allies of the state. So in that sense, these kind of environmental movements or the defense of one's own space are essentially contradictions, confrontations, are protest against an element. What are the societal goal of these kind of movements? Manuel Castells says that the societal goal of these kind of movement where the essential issue is the local space is for a better quality of life. The societal goal is to ensure livelihood security. The societal goal is to claim autonomy over the local space, right over the local resources. So therefore the societal goal of these movements is to claim right over local space, right over local resources and local sources of livelihood. In that sense, when we see Indian environmental movements, most of the Indian environmental movements which essentially are forest based movements, water based movements again mining, where there are issues of a development project resulting in certain kind of displacement, they may be categorized, they may be classified into this category of environmental movement. So the second category of environmental movement is that of defense of one's own space. So these kind of environmental movement essentially talk about a confrontation, essentially talk about a common adversary, which is that of capitalism, capitalist state, or the allies of the capitalist state. The third kind of environmental movement, in fact, is perhaps more interesting. Castells says that the third category of environmental movements are counterculture environmental movement. What do we mean by counterculture? Castells defined counterculture as challenge to the established norms of the society. So in that sense, what Manuel Castells says that counterculture environmental movement essentially challenge the already establishing norms of the society. So in that sense, these category of environmental movement challenge or question the anthropocentric norm of the society. These kind of environmental movement challenge the patriarchal norms of the society. So the most commonly held examples of this counterculture environmental movements may be identified as the deep ecology movement in the United States, the Earth First in Europe, and the ecofeminist movements that has emerged in the global south. So these movements, whether made with the deep ecology movement or the ecofeminist or ecofeminism, they essentially challenge the established norm of the society. The deep ecology movement challenges the anthropocentric view of the modern society, which believes that human beings are central and nature exists to support human life on the earth. So the basic idea of anthropocentrism is that human beings are superior species and nature exists for the benefit of human life. And similarly, the ecofeminism also challenges the patriarchal vision of society, the patriarchal social organization, and it associates or it relates women with that of nature. So in that sense, ecofeminist movements and deep ecology movements which criticize the already established norms of the society, they may be considered as counterculture environmentalism. And what are the adversaries of these movements? The adversary of these movements are industrialism, modern science and technology, and the institutions of patriarchy. So these movements essentially question the existing established pattern of the society along with their concern for nature. So in that sense, the counterculture environmental movements are not necessarily single issue movement which talk about only the nature. These environmental movements question the larger ideology of the society. These environmental movements question the larger existing pattern of organization in the society. So in that sense, they argue against anthropocentrism as well as they argue against patriarchal social order. What is the larger societal goal of this movement? What do these kind of counterculture environmental movements aim to achieve? Manuel Castells says that the larger societal goal of these environmental movements are eco-utopia. They call for an eco-egalitarianism, or they call for an conservation of biodiversity. So in that sense, these movements aim at achieving a kind of society where there will be equal respect for all species, where human beings will be considered as one element in the ecosystem, where human beings will be considered in parallel with other forms of life in the ecosystem. So in that sense, the fundamental goal of these movements is not only to just to preserve the nature, but to contrast, but to challenge the existing ideology of society. So these movements therefore challenge the ecocentric, so these movements therefore challenge the anthropocentric philosophies of society, anthropocentric ideologies of the society, and they call for an ecocentric ideology. They call for an egalitarian ideology. They question anthropocentrism, the fundamental order of the society, and they question the patriarchal social order. The fourth category of environmental movements that Manuel Castells talk about is that of Save the Planet movement. In contemporary times, these movements or Save the Planet movement have emerged as global environmental movements, because the kind of issue that they raise are not limited to any particular geographical region. Unlike the second category of environmental movement, where we discuss the central issue is claiming the space or claiming the local autonomy, in this case, or in this case of environmental movements or the Save the Planet movements, the issue is that of the planet Earth. The issues that this movement talk about are essentially global issues. So therefore, the examples of these kind of movements will include like concern for global warming, the climate change movements, the movement against ozone depletion, the movement against marine pollution. So therefore, environmental activists or environmental organizations like Greenpeace forerun these kind of environmental movements. So here environmental movements truly become a global movement because the issues that they raise are essentially global in nature. What is the common identity that these kind of movements frame, or what is the common identity that helps in bringing people together for these kind of collective mobilizations? The common identity that these kind of movements frame is that of a global eco-warrior. So these participants, so the movement participants in this case, term themselves as global eco-warriors, and their aim is to save the planet Earth. So therefore, they highlight on concepts like global citizenship, and they reject the boundaries of nation. So in that sense, these kind of movements essentially talk about global cooperation, global citizenship. They talk about global associations and discussions at the global level, and they consider these kind of movements consider environmental problems as global problems which can find a solution only through a global cooperation. What is the adversary of these kind of movements? The major adversary or the major enemy of these kind of movements is the global capitalist development or the global industrial development. So therefore, these kind of movements identify their enemy, their adversary, as global capitalism. With regard to their societal goal, these movements talk about, or these movements aim at achieving a sustainable maintenance of ecosystem. So therefore, caring for the earth, or ensuring sustainability of the earth or sustainable development ultimately become the goal of these kind of movements. So these kind of movements doesn't talk about local autonomy, these kind of movement doesn't talk about claim over local resources, these kind of movement doesn't talk about issues of livelihood and local pollution. These kind of movement talk about global issue. In that sense, issues of materiality, issues of physicality are not foregrounded in these kind of environmental movement. These kind of movement portray them, position them as global environmental movements, and they talk about global issues where local issues of pollution, local issues of autonomy over space, local issues of sharing resources are not prominent here. And with regard to the method of protest, these movements adopt a more consensual method. These movements adopt networks. This movement functions through networks of different organizations, networks of different global organizations. They talk about transnational activism, they talk about transnational networks. So in that sense, these movements function through different kind of NGOs, through different kind of environmental movement organizations, which essentially talk about global networking. like for example, organizations like Greenpeace, organizations like Earth First. These organizations have their networks in almost all countries in the world, and these organizations functions through their networks. So in that case, environmentalism or environmental movement become more institutionalized here. Like as we discussed in the beginning of this class, the conventional social movement framework failed to understand these kind of environmental movements, because these kind of environmental movement mostly functions through institutionalized manners, through networks, and they emphasize more on organizations. These movements can be anti-systemic as well as they may work along with the system. But what is important or what is essential point about this kind of environmental movement is that they invoke the idea of global, they invoke the idea of international. Environmental movements are global problems, and therefore they require global solutions, they require global action and global cooperation. The last and the fifth kind of environmental movement that they talk about, or that Manuel Castells talk about, is about green politics, where environmental movement has been institutionalized through democratic politics, through elections or through the voting system. Especially these kind of environmental movements can be observed in Western European and in Scandinavian countries, where there are well established green political parties. So therefore examples of these kind of environmental movements will be institutionalized environmental movements, green political parties who contest elections and who try to capture political power through democratic means. So here therefore the identity that this kind of movement produces is that of concerned citizens, is that of environmentally conscious citizens, is that of a moral responsibility towards the nature. So therefore these kind of environmental movements, or the green politics, basically tries to portray a common identity of aware citizens, of conscious citizens. So therefore it becomes an ethical responsibility to protect the nature, a moral responsibility to protect the nature. So the major adversary of these kind of environmental movements are the political establishment, because the ultimate aim is to capture political power and to establish environmentalism through political institutions, through political mechanisms. So therefore the central adversary is the political establishment who promote environmentally destructive policies, who promote environmentally destructive activities. So the central goal or the fundamental goal of this kind of environmental movement is to capture political power, is to counter the established political power, and to bring out policy reforms, to bring about environmental policies which will, or environmental governance system which will result in restoration of the balance of nature. In that sense, these environmental movements are highly institutionalized. These environmental movements are highly formal. So the method of protest of these environmental movements are through democratic participation, are through democratic means. So therefore if we see these categories of environmental movements, these 5 categories of environmental movements, based on the definition that we produced, based on the conceptualization of environmental movement that we did in the first part of this video, we may realize that many of the contemporary environmental movements becomes difficult to conceptualize through the classical or conventional social movement framework. Because as we discussed, these categories of environmental movements work inside the system, they are part of the system. Sometimes they work through institutionalized mechanisms, sometimes they work through democratic political systems. So therefore the conceptual so therefore the conventional definition of a social movement, that social movements are anti-systemic, social movements are anti-institutional, somehow doesn't apply here. Because these categories of environmental movements that we discussed, many of them are, or they work along with the institution, many of them work along with the state. So therefore to summarize this of the video, we may say that broadly we may identify 5 categories of environmental movements. So we may summarize that we may broadly identify 5 categories of environmental movement. While some of these environmental movements are institutionalized or they function through institutional mechanisms, others functions through direct action, through confrontation or through conflict with the system. Especially the movement about claiming autonomy over the local space or defense of local space, they are essentially direct action environmental movements. They are essentially environmental movement which involve confrontation, which involve protest against an explicit adversary, protest against an explicit enemy. Whereas different other movements or several other movements, for example the green politics or sustainable development, save the planet, they are more global environmental movement which prefer to function through organized means, which prefer to function through institutionalized means. So therefore, institutional cooperation, institutional debates, through international cooperation, they try to find solution to environmental problems. So in that sense, when we summarize environmental movement, what therefore becomes central is to define environmental movement is the shared concern for planet Earth, shared concern for the ecosystem, or shared concern for nature. It doesn't matter whether they are organized or unorganized, it doesn't matter whether they are formal or informal. What defines therefore environmental movement is the shared concern for nature.